we have the next speaker for API Summit 2021, and she is Diana. Hi, Diana. Can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can. Welcome to API Summit 2021.
Thank you.
Yeah, and yeah, for the attendees, I think let me take this opportunity to introduce Diana to all of you. She's going to speak on the topic deconstructing the automation testing pyramid as we know it and the world of APIs. Speaking about her profile, Diana is an automation engineer with Vulcan Cyber and hails from Israel. She is an active speaker and participant in various talks and conferences as a speaker. Diana is currently working on her MBA. She has two children, and she also has a feisty American bulldog. She's an automation engineer by profession, and yeah, I did get a chance to attend a couple of her sessions, I guess, speeches before this particular session, and then yeah, please feel free to get in touch with her on LinkedIn. This is her speaker profile. You are able to see it in the slide, and then yeah, I think I would like to hand it over to you, Dana. Please feel free to share your screen, and then we can get started. Welcome again.
Just a second, and I will share my screen with you. Yes, start from there. So, hi everyone. I'm feeling really honored to be here. I love the first presentation by Praveen. It was really awesome. What I want to talk about is a little bit about deconstruction the automation testing pyramid. And what I do want to focus on is about my experience in a Vulcan Cyber as a single person in the QA department, in the automation department. Essentially, I am the department, and how I built the process throughout being as a single person in a newly funded recently company with a product that constantly changes. So you've introduced me, so I do have to say that it wasn't my first choice. I did my dual degree in physics and material engineering, and I really came into this world of software engineering really throughout a career retaining. And I had my first opportunity in Philips, which was an amazing opportunity because it was, again, a newly funded team, and I learned there a lot. So in terms of working in a big company like Philips versus working in a startup, it's a huge difference. And the biggest one is like all the responsibility lays on my shoulder. I need to decide and I get to vote. So if there's something I want you to take out from this talk that I have is, while we have our own guidelines, we're doing like courses like ISTQB, we can find a huge amount of information on the internet. Sometimes the reality of our product or our platform won't actually match those guidelines, and we need to think, what can I take from what I know from my experience that will work for me, what will work best for the product. Sometimes it actually goes against every logic, but in order to gain the full impact of your test, of your methodology, you need sometimes to take a step back and to think, okay, this is what I know and this is what will work. And this is what I want to talk to you about a little bit, like, how do you build this pyramid? I know we had this session before, someone did this and it was awesome, and he talked about the whole 5 steps, but I will kind of be on the 2 major steps, would be the API and the UI test. And what I want to focus about is why is this pyramid, why we even doing this pyramid? And the biggest reason we're doing is because it has its logic. We use the time, the money, the cost, the duration, all those reasons to build this pyramid. So in the base, we do have the unit tests, which test basic fragments of the code, usually, and from my experience, done mostly by the software developers, by the engineers, people who write the code. Whether it's in the front end or in the back end, it does not matter. They test what they do, and they should, because how else would they know if it works, and how else would they test their own features? So we assume they do that. It is a part of their practice, of their as a code review, it's done there. But we're not really responsible. We, and I mean every QA department. We practically don't have any contact with this UI unit test for that matter. So the next layer is our layer. And what I mean is, in terms of quality assurance for all.
Diana, are you sharing some slides? Because we are seeing the screen only. There are no slides that we are seeing.
Oh, sorry, I apologize. Yes, I shared. Hang on. Maybe you see now? Let me know.
I think so.
You don't see? Sorry, I apologize again. I'll try it out.
So we are seeing the screen, the Mac screen, but not the slide deck.
Oh, this is unfortunate. Hang on, I'll try this out again. And how it goes. Hang on, maybe I'll rejoin and you can hear me again. And and then I'll do share again with my content. Do you see this now?
Yes.
Sorry. Where was I? So can you see this now?
Yes, yes.
Absolutely. Thanks. So no, thank you for letting me know. So what I was referring is like the next layer of testing and quality assurance would be the API test, or the, for example, service test, what we call. So this test would be, those tests will be the most important tests that we lay down. Why? Because they're actually can be done quickly, efficiently. They can test a variety of things. We can test a lot of the things without even seeing the product. We can test the data, we can test everything. So this is actually our first layer of quality responsibility, and we want to make it as broad as possible to have the best foundations, because we will use it mostly, and mostly it will save our time. But the top of the pyramid will be conducted from the UI test, and we would like to have this test as smaller as possible. And by small, I don't mean like 5 tests. I mean compared to the API layer. So if the API would be a lot of tests, the UI will be a little bit less. Why? Because UI is fragile. UI costs time. UI costs money. UI is something that you need to maintain all the time. UI is something that you don't want to have more than your API. Why? Because essentially all you will do is constantly talking with those tests, because they're really, really fragile and unstable. And this is the biggest disadvantage of having UI tests. And by not having the layer of the API test, you will be forced to create broad coverage of UI tests, and essentially will lead you to have a lot of time spending on maintaining them and creating them. However, and here's the problem. In theory, everything works. In practice, sometimes not. So what happens when you cannot do and work by those guidelines? So what happens if you have, for example, like I have a newly founded startup or something redesigned application. If you're a new team or a small team and you got your new app or something like that, or some changes were made, you bought company. So sometimes you will come across a new app, and you don't always will know what to do. So you come through a new app and you're your own person. You don't have another person. You don't always have a team. Sometimes you're a single QA person. And then if you lay on top of that the constant changes those applications have, and by changes, I mean those changes are, for example, feedbacks from clients, changes that goes through some services are no longer needed. So constant flow of changes that impacting your platform. And it's not always in a bad form, but it's always happening. And by not bad form, I mean like, okay, seeing me? And of course, we have always the human factors. By human factors, we mean decisions that are not always up to us, not always up to our team leads, not always up to our size. Sometimes it's about product decisions, sometimes it's about above. So some of these elements are, if you add them together, you will get the worst nightmare that automation tester or even manual tester, any tester will have, which might lead to incorrect behavior of your platform, to missing requirements that you need to dig throughout them, lacking documentation, and wrong requirements, which means we have some requirements, but they're not really up to date. Maybe the clients were promised a behavior that gives A, but essentially does B. Some flows are not really possible, other flows are not really corresponding. So this is basically a huge nightmare in terms of QA automation, and worse nightmare in terms of testing, because we cannot really work when we don't have our requirements, when we don't have what we need to perform tests. I mean, think about, how do I conduct a test on something that I'm not sure is absolutely true and right? So what do? You basically use what you have. And my next thing is, you do a list of what you have. And those lists can be what time I have on my hand. Do I have time to develop framework? Do I need to use outsourced tools? And if I use outsourced tools, then how much money can I spend? Because if I'm developing or using some open source, it means I have to spend time to customize it, to make it work for me, to make it especially for me. So when I say open source, it's not always free of charge. You save maybe the money about the source, but you will spend a lot of time, your own time, to customize that. The next would be define your goals. In that matter of, if I have a lot of time, then I would like to work properly, to use the right methodology. I would create a vast layer of API tests. I would create, if I need more tests, but I would work from this pyramid from bottom to the top. Why? Because I will save in the long run the money, the time. It will be more stable. It will be very well done, and mostly it will be something that I can trust. If I can trust my test, then I don't need to recheck them. Next would be understanding the priorities. In that matter, if my first priority would be to make sure how this app works, then is the first thing I will do. And if it takes me the time to sit and to actually, I don't know, open an Excel to write all the, not necessarily the requirement because you're not the product, but write down your requirements for your test. I need for this test to work, so I need to understand how those features correspond. I need to understand what the right flows. I need to write down my needs. I need somebody to sit with me. I need to sit and talk with team A, team B, team C, to understand what their areas, what they're in charge of, and to understand how do I work this out. So I'm working my priorities in that sense from really, again, top to the bottom. The first priority would be to understand what I have. Next would be to define to myself the goals, to write down on Excel or using any other tools for that matter. It's not about tools, it's about how I approach this and creating those things. And list, be your own champion. In the essence, don't expect anyone to do your job for you. It's really important. If you are the only person at the beginning in the product, you don't have anyone else to rely on in terms of your work and who you're depending. So be your own champion, get to the right people. Don't be afraid to sit down with the product and the product owners or the project owners, the team leads, the developers. Sit down, understand what it does. In the long run, it will pay off. Why? In the worst case, if you don't have the right documentation for your features, you will have it for yourself. You can write down your own flows, you can write down your own tests. And I'm talking about writing down STDs or STPs. It's something that I mostly see, I have to admit, in extremely great organized companies or companies that have already a lasting product. It's not something you come across in a startup or new teams. Sometimes this lack of documentation is not ill intention for that matter. It's a matter of, we had this idea and we ran with that and we had a POC and we developed something and now we show it for the customers. They like it. We got funded, but now it's time to step up our game and show our product to someone else. And the next thing we do is validate the quality. We don't want to develop any more bugs. We have our POC, we proved our concept, somebody liked it, somebody paid for that. But now we need to bring everything else up to this date. And sometimes in this point, you might find yourself really lacking the knowledge. It means maybe sometimes the product left, sometimes the team lead left, somebody left and didn't update their documentation. The product didn't do their job. Somebody just couldn't, or there was no product for that matter. So sometimes it's just not there. What do? You do it by yourself. You write this down, you write your test based on that, you attach those tests to your ticket system or to your flow system, whatever systems you use, and then you start write down your test. And why it's important? Because in startups mainly, really, constant change will appear, but then you'll have a starting point to say, hey, I wrote this test with your approval. I wrote this test based on that. And if it fails or won't be current, you can always update your own tests. You can always update your own documentation. And might be the time that your documentation will need to be based on some other documentation. So it's really important to keep track of your own work. It's important as writing this test. Yes, I'm a fan of NAMs, really. So what do you do when you come across a situation when there's nothing and you're lacking? You work from top to bottom in this case. You do something you wouldn't usually do. You create UI test coverage. Why? Because you don't know if there is enough coverage in the unit test or if there are any unit tests. Sometimes they're not there. Why? Because this app was developed quickly, fast, or to prove a concept, and now it's lacking. Or it's not always a bad practice, sometimes just lacking practice. So the first thing you would do is create a UI tests. Why? Because UI covers it all. And it will cover everything from the services to the user experience. It will give you any sense of behavior towards your application and how it interacts with your clients, how it interacts with your system, how it interacts with third party. You will use that and you will actually create your UI test as the main coverage. And after you will have great coverage by using UI, and by great I mean 100 or 200 tests, something you would ideally do, or at least not in this point, you can then step up your game and say, okay, so at least I covered myself in terms of UI. I can now assure that at least the basic features, the important flows, the most usable flows by clients, by the most promoted features are tested. And I can see it, and I can guarantee to you that at least on this basic level of the smoke, of the sanity, of the regression, some nightly runs, we can assure that we have a coverage. Next, I would say, okay, I've stepped up my game. Now I need to back to my pyramid. Why? Because we talked about it. It is important. It will save in the long run your time and mostly your money. API test would be a little bit different from how you would build it if you were coming from the bottom. In this case, your API test will on the first step will be something that cannot be tested by the UI or some expansion of the UI tests. Elements that are really, for example, what can I not test by UI? Any integration that has API. For example, if my application has any connectors or third-party connections and I get data from them, I cannot test it by the UI. I mean, I cannot see what I get. But what I can do is conduct an API test. If I have a third-party interaction, my app that interacts with third-party, then I can test what I send and what I receive. So those tests would be like filling out the gaps the UI cannot fill. And the most important will be expansions of things that I don't want to test anymore in the UI. I don't need. If I have a line that all it does is test, for example, a search line, think of Google, for example, and I have all my magic search filters, for example, then I don't want to test my whole 1,000 options. I don't need to do it. My UI will test the 1 to 2 the most common filters, while any other option or combination can be tested by the API because I already know that it works. So at the first level, it will be covered by the UI. The next would be every other filling the gaps, I would call it, in the test. And the next level would be, of course, I would hope for my developers, my software engineers will have unit test or something that will cover their code segments. However, as I said before, unfortunately, we cannot always assure that. So I always hope that my engineers will bring their game or step up to their game, because it is extremely important to have the most layer of testing, because the more layer we have, the bigger the ability to catch bugs. And the next would be the most important for me as a concept to understand that the next thing would be getting back to this pyramid. Because if my purpose was to create the broadest sanity, the quickest way, for example, now that I have this, I want to use this to use my API test as I've used them already on top of my UI coverage. And the next would be to turning this pyramid around, which means if at first I used my API test to cover something the UI cannot test or some elements that that weren't there, so the next would be use this ready to use framework and turn those tables around, which means now that I have created this framework, I would say I'm stepping down from the UI test, because essentially it cost me a lot of time and money. If anyone does UI test, it knows that it's so fragile. The maintenance itself over the time is really exaggerating. You need to keep up your elements, you need to step up, and in a framework or an application that constantly changes, you are constantly chasing your own tests. And sometimes, from my experience, you have tests that you can do like 5-6 times. Why? Because today it was a button, next it would be a checkbox, or some elements are now reduced and changed. So in that matter, if I can turn the table around and say, no, I'm using API layer as my broader step, then I'm reducing the UI element and I'm reducing the maintenance. So it is, it's not essentially deconstructing the whole pyramid, it's working your way towards the pyramid, but adjusting it to the way that will work for you best. So that's it. Thank you so much. Hey.
Yeah, Rituraj, we can't hear you. You are on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, I was speaking and I was on mute. Sorry. Yeah, I said that thanks to you, Diana. Yeah, again, a wonderful session. All those insights were really wonderful, amazing. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Do we have any questions for her? Cannot see anything in the chat though.
I do have to add that I know it's really uncommon, because I know a lot of people work in really large corporations sometimes, and the whole notion of startups or small team is not so common. But it does something you come across in Israel, for example, because we have a lot of startups. So you may find yourself in a position of being really like the only QA person or the only quality person. And sometimes it can be scary in terms of not everything we know applies. So if you really take anything, is like take all your knowledge and apply it in the way that will work for you, and not necessarily would work throughout the methodology. The methodology is here to help us and not like to put rigid guidelines on us and say you can do only this and that.
Yeah, well said. Maybe I can ask you one question, that whichever practice which you just mentioned based upon your individual experiences, were there any situations where you or your team felt it like it is completely a deadlock situation and then you are unable to proceed ahead? Something sort of that, if you would like to share some experience with us.
Deadlocks, no, but a lot of times especially in startups and really new startups, there is always constant changes. And the one thing that you can always keep up, and it's not a deadlock, it's a kind of a little bit frustrating situation that UI constantly changes and they put up your changes and try to up to date you, but you can't you can't update your test as quickly as they change it sometimes, even if they announce you. So you have to work on a process which you all update the changes at the same time. So it's really important, or sometimes they don't take into account what tests dependencies are. I mean, on the outside layer, it looks like we only change a checkbox, but maybe my test uses not only this checkbox, it uses like a flow dependent on this checkbox. So by reducing it or removing it, you essentially took not only one test, but another 10 that depend on that. So sometimes it's by accident, sometimes it's really like unintentional, and it's a lot about working process, how you work this to work best from their side and from my side. I hope it's kind of answered that.
Yeah, it really. Okay, we have one more question coming in for you. You talked about maintenance. Could you please elaborate more on tips to reduce test duplication when it is a complex system with various microservices and APIs?
Absolutely. So not all the systems are microservice, but essentially microservice is a little bit about how the systems are built, and not everybody really fond of that. But if people using microservice, it means they build a lot of services, and usually you would test them using API, because then you can test each service, and then you can test all the services as a flow, and you don't even need to go through all the UI. For example, I worked in another startup and there was like a money transaction. So you don't need your UI you can just work throughout your API. You can use some fake data and to get the output that you wish. In this case, if you don't have your API, you will have to do this whole flow using the UI. Now think of that, it's extremely fragile situation because it depends on a lot of elements. So in this case, you would do a UI test. It will be an end-to-end, a long flow test. But if something changes in the middle, for example, you used a coupon, but it's no longer updated in the system, bam, your whole UI test just went out of anything because it has no meaning. While in the API you would get in a few seconds in really less maintenance, in the UI you would get a whole lot of commodity around it. And think of it, it was only one test. What happens if you have 100 like that? So this is what I'm talking about when you choose to do a vast cover of UI. You saying to myself that I note that I have to take the time in the day. If my day consists of, let's say, 8 hours, then 2 to 3 hours each day would be conducting maintenance and go over tests that failed, because I usually fail from weirdest reasons. For the browser wasn't open, the tab wasn't loaded, and it had nothing to do with your app. So this is what I'm talking about, maintenance versus like using just an API.
Okay, good. Anything specific you would like to highlight in terms of the documentation? Any specific tools or something you would like to highlight, or are you making use of simple Word documents or Excel sheets to have your own documentation? Yeah.
Yes, so the first thing I did, as I said, it was being my own champion. So there was really a lot of documentation from obvious reasons, like a new product. So what I did was doing, even before I used any outsourced tool, I just opened an Excel, simple Excel, and mapped all my application, all the features, all the tabs, everything, just mapped it out on my Excel. The next thing I did was see what documentation I can have or what flows I have related that I can test. So then I marked everything that is considered important for my sanity, because the thing that I was brought was like, listen up, we don't have a sanity, we need to keep this up. And so the first thing was, okay, if I'm doing a sanity should at least cover the basic functionalities that the app has, but also that will give the added value for the customers that use them. So if they use certain points in the app, I would like to mark them down as more important and create this sanity more like a customer oriented. So this is the first thing I did. So I created DevSanity using UI. And here I do have to admit that since I really wasn't, there wasn't a team, there was only me, and I needed to create my UI. So my decision was to use outsourced tool. For that matter, I use testing, by the way. But my decision to create my API would be actually in-house. I created my own framework, and I did work with for example, we write in Python, so I am wrote in Python for that matter. Why? Because it really collaborates with the framework that we have in the company. So the goal was to create the fastest sanity that I can. So it was UI choosing outsourced tool. So it's save time, but spend a little bit more money, and save time on the maintenance. And however, again, spending more time, money. So this would be the time and money trade-off. And the next would be, now that I can breathe, and I have more time, and I've used already my API to fill all the gaps, I can use and broaden my framework and use it to make it a really larger coverage in the API.
Awesome. I think I can correlate this thing which you just said to those four puzzle kind of things which we are able to see onto the slides. I think you just need to cover sooner, faster, better, and cheaper way of doing it, right? That's what you wanted to say.
Yes, I
Right?
want to say that sometimes we take our time as really, we are here so we have time, but no, our time is valuable. We choose how to prioritize that.
Yeah.
So if I'm spending on framework, I'm not spending on doing something else. And we usually, that's what I'm saying. I always hear that open source is cheap. No, you spend time on it. It's not cheap, it's your time. So we need to start to treat our time as a source and an asset, and saying, if I'm spending time on that or maintaining that, I'm not producing any added value. So this is really extremely, I think it's important to keep this up when we're working.
Absolutely. Yeah. I completely agree with you on what you just said. Yeah, so I think we can wrap it up now. This is the feedback URL for Diana's session. Please submit your valuable feedbacks. And yeah, thank you so much, Diana, for being with us today. Your session was really amazing. Yeah. In fact, I got to learn so many new things today. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.